Good evening. Tonight we're inside the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament, of course, sits. We're here in Westminster Hall, where over 350 years ago Charles I was tried. And for 900 years this place has been at the very heart of British history, and tonight of Question Time. And welcome to our audience here, who are shivering rather. There's no central heating in this place, and 900 years ago I think there'd have been braziers all round. But tonight it's quite cold. And a welcome to our panel. Our panel, the Work and Pensions Secretary, Iain Duncan Smith, the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Charles Kennedy, the columnist on The Independent, Owen Jones, and the businesswoman and star of Dragon's Den, Deborah Meaden. Okay, well, we'll warm up with a question from Roberto Campana, please.
Should Parliament now consider amending sex discrimination legislation to cover the Church of England?
After the refusal to allow women to become bishops, should sex discrimination legislation, which didn't cover the Church of England, be amended? Deborah Meaden.
I'm staggered by what happened this week. I mean, I see both sides of most arguments, and this argument I just absolutely do not get, that it's such a tiny portion of the church could say that they don't want women to be bishops, and for that to mean that the status quo remains. So I really do not get it. However, I'm also not sure that it's Parliament's place to intervene, because I think this is about a faith. This goes to the heart of many people, obviously, and I feel like it should be left with those people to sort it out. And actually, for me, the most important thing is, I think they know they made a mistake. How they deal with it is either going to mean that the church has a viable future, or it's going to actually eat itself alive. Okay. And that would be an awful thing to happen, but I still don't believe it's Parliament's place to sort it.
Okay. Charles Kennedy.
Well, I think that, first of all, I don't agree with the decision that they arrived at, and it's a rather curious sort of electoral college that they've got that they're going to have to look at. Although, I have to say, in the years in this place, as a Scottish Roman Catholic, I've always felt that I should not have too much to say and not cast votes on how the Church of England actually goes about it.
You don't exactly have women priests, do you?
No, and I'm not in agreement with that in my own church, as a matter of fact. But there was a sensible set of exchanges in the Commons chamber just a few yards from here this morning on this issue. And I think what we'll see, I mean, the new Archbishop coming in has probably got as rough an entry in front of him as the new Director General of the BBC, actually. I think you could vie for which is the worst start scenario to a new big position in society. But he clearly wants to tackle it. It can't corrode his forthcoming period as Archbishop, the way in which it's dogged Dr. Rowan Williams' period. And I think that, you know, the figures speak for themselves. 1/3 of those administering the Anglican ministry within England are female. Well, to say that there's, as it was rather well put by an MP this morning, there's a stained glass ceiling on the legitimate ambitions and progress of those women is ludicrous.
But isn't it true? I mean, the point is that the Church specifically got exemption from the Sex Discrimination Act, didn't it?
I'm not sure.
According to Frank Field, who today wants that withdrawn. They did. So they're given by Parliament, they're given exemption. By constitutional right, they sit in the House of Lords and legislate. So they're different from just any old church, aren't they? They're an established church that are behaving.
I think if you look at it historically, and there was discussion about this earlier today, there isn't a great deal to be gained from Parliament, and particularly the House of Commons, and the decision-making processes of the Church of England getting into some big head-to-head in a standoff. And I think clearly, I mean, do remember, the bishops, with very few exceptions, were arguing strongly in favour of this change. It was just an aspect of the laity that were opposed and were able to block it by a very tiny margin.
Okay, person up there at the back, and the second row from the back. Yes.
I actually agree with Deborah that I don't think it's Parliament's place to intervene. I think it's a decision for the Church. What I do think Parliament should consider is whether the bishops should remain in the House of Lords, given this kind of opinion of the Church.
Owen Jones.
I think the problem when we're saying it's none of our business is this. We have an established church. And I think, in terms of the problem we've got at the moment, is the church is unwilling to enter the 20th century, let alone the 21st. That doesn't mean as a society we can't enter the 21st century and follow the lead of many other advanced countries, Western countries, and disestablish the church. What that would mean in practice is independence for the state and the church, where neither can stick their noses in each other's business. Now, the church at the moment could argue, legitimately, 88%, what right do I have to get into their affairs? Like 88% of the population, I don't regularly attend a church. So I think for me, the point to make is actually if we disestablish the church, we protect the rights of people's private religious beliefs, which is very important. We take religion out of the public life in that sense and defend it as a private matter, then I don't think we'll have these sorts of problems. But as long as they remain established and the bishop's bench in the House of Lords remains preserved only for men, it is all of our business.
The basis of Parliament is that the people who make the laws have to live under the laws. Therefore, I think we should amend the legislation so that it covers the Church of England and they have to live under the law, like the rest of us.
Iain Duncan Smith, do you agree with that?
One thing I would say, actually, Brother Andrews, is in line with my predecessor Norman Tebbit, who also argued for disestablishment of the church. I bet that's the first time you've ever been told you're just like
It's a
Norman.
rare agreement,
Very good. But I'm not. I'm a Catholic like Charles, and so the Church of England, it's established church, and I accept that, therefore, that brings greater responsibility, in a sense, with regards to what it does inside Parliament. But I'm rather with Deborah on this point. I don't want Parliament to have to go and lay its heavy hand across the church and dictate to the church about what it should do. I think the reality for us here right now is that the Church of England is going to get women bishops. The question is, how do they get there in the short term? And the vote, by the way...
How many years has been going on?
Well, I looked at the vote.
Years?
It's interesting, the vote was quite complex, because what fascinated me was, actually it broke. Some of women who wanted women bishops actually ended up voting against the motion alongside those who didn't want women bishops, because they said those who didn't want women bishops had been granted too much license, so they didn't like it. So, in other words, these things are never quite as simple as you think. And that's why, if we walked in as Parliament and started hammering and legislating, we could do more damage. But there's no question...
What do you say to that man's point, that you can't have bishops legislating in the House of Lords when the church has this kind of discrimination going on? And they're there by right. You say you don't want to disestablish the church. They're there by right.
Well, I think the answer is we put pressure on them to change their position, that in the House of Lords they need to have that greater equality.
How do you give... I mean, the Prime Minister said...
Well, they're under pressure now.
What's the sharp prod that you'd give them?
Well, I would simply say that, you need to get this done, or it may be that we would enter into your realm and start doing something. But we don't want to do it. My point is they need to get their act together. The truth is, it was such a small degree that could have been changed, they would have got it through. So there is a level of competence.
Well, one vote is enough, as you know, as a politician.
Absolutely.
Yvette Cooper.
Yeah, I think, for a start, that Iain's position would be more credible and the Prime Minister's position would be more credible if, in fact, there were rather more women in the Cabinet, where we've seen actually the number of the women in Cabinet fall over the last few years. But I also think this was a dreadful decision by the Church of England. The vast majority of not just the bishops, the clergy, but also members of the Church of England across the country, a diocese, supported women bishops. I think they were outmanoeuvred by a vocal minority. And yet we have the Queen is the head of the Church. We have some fantastic women priests, including the woman chaplain in the House of Commons, who is excellent. And I think it is just shocking that the Church is effectively saying to those women, it's okay to do the flowers, to sit on the pews, to do sermons occasionally, but you can't be a bishop. It's shocking. They cannot let this lie. We have to have this changed within the next 5 years and not wait.
But not by us.
Okay. The person there, you, sir, and then I come up to you, and then we must move on. Yes.
Well, doesn't this just show that we shouldn't listen to the Church of England on anything? It's just a flagrant kind of it's an arm of the state. It's an all-pervasive arm of the state. It shouldn't be an arm of the state anymore if it acts in this way.
Okay.
And the point there is, look, most of us now we don't attend religious services. We're a diverse nation. We have people who are Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs in this country. It's a bit anachronistic to have us as an officially Christian nation when other countries have separated church and state and let each get on with their own business without intervening in each other's affairs.
You, sir.
Clearly, the decision seems like a very strange anomaly, but all religions are full of anomalies. And if we start legislating about this specific act, are we also going to legislate that the Roman Catholic Church should have female priests, or even go the length of Germany and start questioning whether Jewish parents are allowed to give their infant children unnecessary surgical operations at birth?
In other words, once you start, do you have to examine all... What did you say briefly?
This is my point about the heavy hand of Parliament. You know, absolutely I agree for those who say there should be women bishops, they should get on with it, but when Parliament moves into this arena, we're more likely to do more damage than we will do good. That's my concern, stamping on everybody's beliefs, when we are not the ones to lecture anybody about what to do, frankly.
The woman up there, and I'll come back to you, Yvette, and then we must go on to another question. Yes?
I just can't help but feel that the Church is losing credibility when it claims to stand for equality but doesn't believe in providing equal opportunities for men and women who wish to follow a career in the Church.
Okay. Yvette, very briefly.
Parliament will have no choice but to play a role in this because the Church of England is different from other faiths. I believe very strongly in freedom of religion. I don't think we should be telling people how to worship. But the problem for the Church of England is it is our national church. It does remembrance, it does the coronations, it does the state funerals, and it is part of our national life because we have 26 bishops sitting in the House of Lords. And Parliament will be expected to pass any change to the rules of the Church of England. I don't think you can expect Parliament to pass unfair rules that are discriminatory rules, and that's why I hope the Church will sort this out. But if it doesn't, Parliament is going to have to work with the Church in order to make sure that the national church can be fair to all.
Okay. Well, now, you know you can join this debate on Twitter if you want to. Our hashtag, you probably know well, BBCQT. We have a Twitter panellist tonight, an anonymous blogger, rather curiously called Archbishop Cranmer, the Protestant martyr. And you can follow him on BBC Extra Guest account. You can text comments to us on 83981 and press the red button to see what others are saying. And we have a question from Paul Hayden, please.
Should Britain forge a new, looser relationship with Brussels?
Should Britain forge a new, looser relationship being the key? I ask you to speak with brevity, because I'm sure a lot of people will have things to say. Iain Duncan Smith.
Well, I think what's happening in Europe at the moment is anyway set for change. Prime Minister spoke about this not so long ago. The reality is that the problems in the euro area is forcing those members of the euro area to actually decide to go deeper in terms of fiscal union. They're now laying plans so that taxation, etc., can be run and overseen centrally. They're talking about a banking union, so that all the banks in all the various member states that are part of the euro will actually get closer tied together. So it's a reality for those, Britain, who are outside the euro. And by the way, I thank God that we are outside the euro. The disaster would have been for us had it been inside the euro. It's a marvel that we're not in the euro, thank God. But so what's happening at the moment, we are seeing, I think, and William Hague has said this, a kind of realignment within Europe. So the question really isn't, should Britain have a looser arrangement? It's that Britain outside, by its very nature over the next few years, is going to find that relationship is going to change. And we need to negotiate, as the Prime Minister said, to make sure that we gain the advantages out of being in part of a trading bloc and cooperating where we definitely need to, but not being sucked into deeper and deeper union where we don't want to be governed by Brussels or by anybody else.
Where do you stand on the key issue of a referendum, of the people of Britain being given a referendum? When would you want that referendum to be held, if you do?
Well, my view about that is that the Prime Minister said the other day, quite legitimately, it will be a referendum. The question really is, what will you be asking about? And that's the point. It's no good just saying we want a referendum. The point is the referendum should be about what that relationship is about. In other words, when we are clear about where this is going to end, we need to be able to ask the British public, is that what you want? Is that relationship, this looser relationship, whatever you call it, is that where we should be? Or would you like to have something different? The referendum
Before
needs
the
to
next
ask a
election
specific
or after
question.
the next election?
I think timing is not the real issue.
Timing is a germane.
Well, no, timing is secondary. The key thing is, what is the question? And that's the point. Everyone says, I want a referendum. My answer is, what do you want a referendum over? It's not just about being in or out. It's actually about saying, what is that relationship? Because we will have a relationship with Europe, regardless of whatever, because we trade with them, we cooperate with them. So the idea somehow there is some blissful place that's different, that's not true.
You, sir.
I think in order to have a debate about a referendum about Europe, we need to have a debate about not just the disadvantages and the problems, but also the advantages of being part of the enormous market that is Europe.
Charles Kennedy.
Well, obviously define a looser relationship. I mean, there are those that say a looser relationship is let's leave the formal structures of the European Union. There are others who would say, and indeed to a certain extent I would subscribe to this word, that a looser relationship means you have more democracy in the institutions of Europe, you have more transparency, you have more decentralisation away from Brussels, across the nations, and indeed within those nations, the regions of Europe. So we can all pay lip service to looser. But Iain and myself are of a vintage in this place. We go all the way back together to the battles of Maastricht 20 years ago. And as he will recall, I was the Lib Dem European spokesman at the time. I spoke in favour and voted in favour of a referendum then on the Maastricht Treaty. I think we need to lance the boil, and so did Iain.
And you want to lance the boil by having a referendum now?
No, I think that...
Why not now, before the election?
Well, because there isn't a proposition. There isn't a practical proposition. And if there was a new treaty, for example, right, that represents a proposition. That doesn't appear to be...
What about the question, would you like to be in or out?
Well, I've always felt, whether it was on Maastricht, whether it was on a single currency, which Tony Blair balked at, or whether it is at some as yet unforeseen further development, which will take place, actually, we all know in our hearts, the argument will come down to, do you want us in or out? And that's a good, honest argument that we need to have, because this issue, and I'm strongly in favour of Britain taking a leading role at the top table in Europe, this issue has bedevilled successive prime ministers and governments, and it's just got to be resolved.
Okay, you sir, then I come to you. Yeah.
It seems a very short-term point of view to say that we need a looser relationship with Europe. Over the next 20 or so years, Britain's going to struggle to find itself in an internationally more competitive international economy. So we need to forge stronger relationships with Europe so that we can remain a significant nation.
Okay, and you sir up there?
I do not understand why the politicians constantly pussyfoot about this. The nation wants a referendum. This is critical. This is costing us a lot of money, and we want somebody to lead us and for the issues to be properly debated. They aren't being properly debated. It makes me think that the politicians in Britain are exactly the same as the politicians in Europe, in as much as it's a nice cosy club and everybody can get a nice bit of expense and a nice bit of salary. Listen to the people and do something about it. It's not good enough.
Deborah Meaden, is that a picture you recognise of political life?
Well, I have to say that in terms of the referendum, if we're going to ask the question, then there needs to be a lot more debate, because when I go about everyday life, most people don't like Europe because of the things that they encounter, actually quite small issues they encounter every day, health and safety, this, and we've got to do that, and that's crazy. And actually, the bigger picture, which is that over 50% of our exports go within the EU, that they create hundreds of thousands of jobs for us, that actually, when we say it's expensive, that the cost of running the EU, the actual people in Brussels is about 6%. Actually, that's not crazy. 6% of their budget, it's not crazy. So if we're going to have it, I think we should have a debate, but if we're going to have a referendum, there needs to be an awful lot more debate and an awful lot more information so that people are making their decisions on the actual facts and what is right and best for this country, and not the frustrations that I feel and everybody feels on a day-to-day basis. Oh, silly health and safety rules. That's not the basis on which to make this decision.
Did you vote for this proposal for a cut in the budget this time, real cut? So would you like to see a referendum? You're obviously quite anti-European if you want that. Yeah?
Well, I think it's actually pro-European to argue for reforms in things like the European budget, because at a time of austerity for a lot of people right across Europe, but certainly in Britain as well, if other budgets are being cut, I think that Europe should take its fair share of the cuts in terms of the European budget.
Charles Kennedy's smiling while you say this.
Because actually that's, otherwise you allow Europe to become discredited and to become pointless and out of touch with the countries that contribute to it.
Well, the joke is I just saw a flock of European pigs fly past the window. But the fact of the matter is, Labour have done this consistently under many Labour leadership. I remember John Smith, he held the Labour Party together over Maastricht because of the social chapter, not because of the pro-Europeanism, because he had more splits in the Labour Party in Europe than were evident. But the Labour Party walked through the division lobbies with the right wing of the Conservative Party.
Charles, you walk through with the right wing of the Conservative Party every single week in division after division to cut tuition, to increase tuition fees, to VAT hike. You do it every single time.
You can't accuse me on tuition fees. I was a party leader, I was against them, I spoke against them under the coalition, and I voted against them.
But your party is continuing to support this coalition government which is doing deeply damaging things.
It's Labour opportunism on Europe which will come back to bite them. And I make that prediction. It will.
Iain Duncan Smith has a...
Well, I just wanted to ask the question. Isn't the reality, though, that Labour in government, saw budget rises of over 50%, saw 2 billion cut off our own rebate and gave it away for nothing, and yet suddenly when you're in opposition you suddenly become incredibly keen on cutting the budget. I don't know where this all came from. When in government you didn't do any of this, you promised a referendum, you didn't give the public a referendum, and now all of a sudden you want a referendum, you want to cut the budget, you want to be jolly good Eurosceptic people. I don't think anyone wants to believe a word.
But hang on, Aren't those three things you'd rather like in your own heart? You're just... because they're in opposition and say you can't say...
No, my point is the Prime Minister is out trying to get that deal. He
wants a referendum.
But he wants a referendum, but we wanted a referendum. It was the Conservatives that wanted the referendum.
In which case, why didn't you vote for it? If, in fact, the government supports a reduction in the EU budget, why did they not support something that the Labour Party put forward, not just most recently, but also in July? We have argued for it consistently. I think it's the right thing to do. Where I disagree with Iain, I think that, in fact, he is actually undermining some of the things that we need from Europe, is around the fight against crime. Iain wants us to pull out of the European arrest warrant, which is actually what has helped us bring terrorists back to this country to stand trial in Britain. I think a looser relationship that actually makes it harder to fight crime is deeply damaging for Britain. You have to argue for the right reforms, the sensible reforms, but you also have to, I think, stay in Europe rather than just turn our backs and walk away.
Okay. Owen Jones.
Look, I think the problem with this is, as a country, we've been denied a proper debate about this, and the reason is this. Any criticism of the EU is seen to automatically place you on the frothing at the mouth, swivel-eyed, xenophobic right. And I think that's absolutely wrong. I think actually arguments about democracy have been surrendered to the right. For example, the Council of Ministers, which wields huge power, only directly accountable to each respective nation who sends ministers to the Council of Ministers. But even when you get to the treaties themselves, often they've enshrined free market economics, free market dogma. Now, it may well be the British people embrace that. I don't think they do, but that should be up to the British people. I'll give you one example. The majority of the British public want to renationalise the railways. In fact, even most Conservative voters want the railways brought back into public ownership. But EU Directive 91/440, which enforces competition on the railways, could prevent that from taking place. So let's have a proper debate about the EU, where it's not about if you criticise it, you want to make it more democratic, you don't want it to enshrine neoliberal economics, particularly at a time in the Eurozone where you're seeing the absolute catastrophe of austerity, a modern European nation like Greece being virtually dismantled with the support of people in the EU, the European Central Bank enforcing those policies. It's not accountable, it doesn't even publish its minutes. So let's have an argument about making it democratic and actually having a Europe that runs in the interests of working people, not the people at the top.
Yep, Deborah, brief point.
Well, very, very quickly, let's make sure that debate is about what's right for this country in the EU and not who did what in terms of the political parties.
You don't trust the political parties?
Well, to be honest, listening to a debate over you said this and you said that and that many years ago, I see heads nodding, and I'm not surprised, because that's the type of thing that sends glazed looks onto the voters, because this is not the point. If I ran my businesses constantly trying to find out, well, who did what in the first place, and you didn't say that, instead of saying, you know what, it doesn't matter. What matters now is what is the right decision for this country, whether or not we go into the EU.
Okay.
Sorry, we are in the EU.
We are in, yes.
You know what I meant.
Slight correction there. Let's go and take another question. A question from Alex Klinger, please. Alex Klinger.
Do you think Israel was justified in bombing Gaza after months of rocket attacks on Israeli civilians?
Do you think Israel was justified in bombing Gaza after months of rocket attacks on Israeli civilians? Charles Kennedy.
Well, I think the line the British government have taken has been the correct one in this. I agree with it, which is that Israel has got a right to defend itself. And I've listened to a lot of Israeli spokespeople, as we all have in our televisions and radios over the last period, pointing out that if our society, our country, was suffering an external threat of this type, well, you can imagine the discussion in a programme like this. There would be an overwhelming public clamour to know why the government of the day wasn't doing something about it. Having said that, it is quite clear that this is no means to a solution at all, and that the two sides, therefore, have got to, under some kind of international auspices, sit down and now move beyond the ceasefire. Thank goodness that appears to be in position, appears to be holding, and try and make progress. The Palestinians are not justified in doing what they have been doing, but equally, Israel's response is a counsel of despair, ultimately. It won't resolve Israel's legitimate security problems, but what the Palestinians, or the extremists Hamas, have been doing won't meet the legitimate needs and demands of the Palestinians either. So we have to get back to sane, rational talks based on 1967 boundaries and a two-state solution. Now, that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to make progress on, given what's happened, and nearly 150, mainly innocent civilians, dead as a result of this dreadful episode that we all deplore.
Owen Jones.
I'm actually disappointed by that response, Charles, in all honesty. Let's be absolutely clear about what happened. Firstly, this whole idea that that Hamas broke the ceasefire is just not true. In fact, it was broken after, in October, Israel killed 15 Palestinian fighters. They shot dead a mentally disabled Palestinian. They killed another 13-year-old in an intrusion. And when there was an attempt to actually get a ceasefire, negotiations were ongoing. That is when they assassinated Ahmed Jabari, completely ending those ceasefire talks. Now, it's often said, and Barack Obama made this point, he said, what country on earth would tolerate rockets being fired at them? I ask you this, what people on earth would tolerate a siege which stops basic supplies getting in, an occupation, a 45-year-old occupation, a brutal occupation at that, illegal settlements all over the West Bank, which are in total violation of international law. And what we've seen in the course of this onslaught are the deaths of 158 Palestinians, at least 30 of whom are children. And I don't want to just throw statistics around. I'll give you one example of one of those children. Omar Mishurin, he was 11 months old. He was a little boy, the son of a BBC journalist, and he was killed in a so-called targeted strike. Now, we all want a secure and lasting peace. When we have Israeli ministers, like the Interior Minister, calling for Gaza to be sent back to the Middle Ages, when in the last offensive we had another minister calling for a Holocaust to be inflicted on Gaza, when we have the son of Ariel Sharon, who wrote in the Jerusalem Post talking about how Nagasaki and Hiroshima were possible solutions to be inflicted. When we have those people, we won't get a secure peace. But the way we will get it for Arabs and Jews alike, to end the occupation, end the siege of Gaza, and dismantle the illegal settlements, and finally have a just settlement for the Palestinian people, ensuring peace for Arabs and Jews and the region as a whole.
You, sir.
I think part of the problem is that people like Owen should actually keep their nose out of something that they have no intimate knowledge of, and that they jump on the bandwagon of this anti-American, ultra-left Israel bashing that is fashionable at the moment. You know, it's all very well for people on the panel and at home to sit in their suburban armchairs with no actual knowledge, intimate knowledge of the conflict.
Sorry, can I just come back to that? I mean, I'm disappointed you didn't engage with a single argument that I just put across.
Right, well, let him finish his point.
Some of the
just personal
terms are bandied around as if they're factually correct.
What did I get wrong? Sorry, correct the fact.
You know, the word pre-1967 territory is bandied around as a given fact, whereas in fact pre-1967 Jordan controlled the West Bank and Gaza, not the Palestinians. There's never been a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza.
What's your view on the question of whether Israel was justified?
I think civilian life is regrettable, and I think, you know, I'm not a person who wholeheartedly agrees with the policies of every Israeli government, but I think that there's a lack of understanding by a lot of people in Britain and in the West generally of the situation that Israel faces when they have no actual knowledge of the history and the complexity of the conflict.
And you sat up there.
I think that gentleman is completely ignorant. He hasn't answered a single question that Owen put to him. Okay. Why is it that President Ahmadinejad of Iran, when he said something about blowing Israel into the Middle Ages, that it received such wide scrutiny, and America are threatening to possibly even go into Iran in the future, but when the Israeli minister says it falls on deaf ears?
Iain Duncan Smith.
Yeah, look, first of all, let's take a pace back from this for a second. This is a tragedy, whichever way you cut it, on either side. The idea that people are bombing each other, killing each other, seeing civilians, children being killed, that's a complete and utter tragedy. And there's never any excuse for any of that. So the reality for us is, how do we get ourselves out of this? The key problem as to who started it.
When you say no excuse, do you mean therefore the bombing was unjustified?
Well, the question really is, did Israel get rocketed first, in which case did they retaliate? My point is, look, we now have a ceasefire. The real hope for us, and this is the real problem in fact, is that the West, America, us, Europe, we took a pace back. For the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years, we've done nothing about the Middle East. Let's be honest, we got completely fixated on the Arab Spring, and we completely forgot that at the heart of this still lies a very, very deep problem between Palestine and Israel. Hamas in the Gaza Strip refused point blank to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. Israel refused to deal with them in Gaza until they do that, and also until they take responsibility for the rockets, etc. So each has taken deeper and deeper entrenched positions. So my point really is here, one thing that may well come out of this, which is really important. Egypt, we worried about, has actually taken up a front and center place. Now that is a very, very good thing. Some leadership from the president of Egypt has got this thing rolling again. We've got, actually, intriguingly, Israel and Hamas having in a peculiar way to recognize each other by both, on the one hand, agreeing to take responsibility for the rocket attacks, and on the other side, agreeing to open the borders. That actually may be the beginning of a start of a change. And we should actually pledge ourselves in the West, with America and the American president, to get behind this and now really find a solution to the two-state problem and get both sides talking to each other, agreeing to acknowledge that each has the right to exist, and basically saying, now's the time to settle this. Otherwise, this could end up further bloodshed and further terror.
Yes, you in the second row. Then yes. Yes, sir.
Is it up to Israel and Palestine to determine whether Palestine has statehood?
Is it up to Israel and Palestine to determine?
Yeah.
In what sense?
Doesn't it go through the UN?
Yvette Cooper.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, because I agree with a lot of the points that Iain has made about the tragedy that has been unfolding and the importance now of having a ceasefire. But a ceasefire is not a peace process. And we have got to have a peace process. There is no military solution that is going to work here, given the history of what has happened in Israel and Palestine, but also the importance of us getting towards a two-state solution and having a meaningful set of negotiations to do that. I think that the debates that are being put forward for the UN are really important. This is an opportunity for the UN to give greater recognition to the Palestinian Authority. I hope that the UN will do that. I hope that the British government will change its position and support the recognition of the Palestinian Authority, because I think that is an opportunity to support a political and a diplomatic process to reach peace, rather than the violence and the rocket attacks and the violence that we have seen over recent months.
Do you think the Foreign Secretary was wrong to lay the blame on Hamas for this?
I think the danger, I mean, look, the immediate trigger of what happened, obviously, was about the rocket attacks on Israel. And, of course, you know, Israelis should be able to live in security and not have to endure the fear from rocket attacks. On the other hand, I think the wider cause, we have to accept the wider cause of what's been happening in the last few weeks has been the failure to have a proper peace process, the failure to have a long-term, sustained negotiation towards a two-state solution, the failure to see progress for the inaction against the illegal settlements that have been taking place, as well as the wider issues and the long-term commitment. We haven't, as a United Nations, taken this seriously enough. That's our opportunity to do so now.
Okay. The woman in the fourth row there.
I wonder that, given that there are now over 500,000 Israelis living within the West Bank, whether anyone on the panel actually still believes that the two-state solution is viable. Why? I mean, is it time to have a debate about a different type of solution?
Deborah Meaden.
I want to go back to, I mean, something the gentleman said over there. The truth of the matter is that I don't live there, and I don't know. I can form opinions reading through the news. Who started this? Who caused, you know, whose fault it was? Trust me, we will never ever understand that. We are in a cycle that has to be broken. I'm absolutely right. It's not going to be a military answer to this. But I think what the ceasefire has done is it's hopefully created space so that you don't have to have these debates in this state of high tension. That actually it says, right, everybody stop for a minute, because trying to get back to, actually, I suspect we were pretty guilty of causing all of this at some point, you know, so it's not about who caused all of this. Now, if people can get their mind wrapped around that, there is no, because I can promise you that for every reason, that's why we bombed, yeah, but we did that because this could go on back for the last 100 years. Until we get our mind wrapped around the fact that it cannot be a military solution. There has to be an end to the blockades. The whole rhetoric needs to be, you know, needs people being able to pass in and out of that country. They need to be able to trade. And until we get our minds wrapped around that, there will be no solution.
Okay. The crucial point you're making is about the existence of those settlements. And I have to say, what other country on earth would be allowed to flout international law in the way that Israel has done for decades?
Well, answer her question. Her question.
Well, the key point there...
You heard what she said, which was that the number of people who have now settled on the West Bank make the two-state solution practically impossible.
There are two possible solutions. One is to have a federal solution where you have equal rights for both Arabs and Jews. That seems to many people obviously far-fetched, but they did say that about South Africa back in the day. Otherwise, you have to dismantle the settlements, enforce international law. But what has to happen, because the point is Britain supports, as other Western countries do, they've supported and armed Israel to the teeth. They're not acting as honest brokers. They have to use their pressure to force Israel to give in and give justice to the Palestinian people.
Owen, thank you. I'm going to take a couple more points from the audience, then we'll move on. Person up there in the back row.
What frustrates me about this conversation is the only reason that we're having it is because rockets were fired. What about, I mean, I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I've spent time volunteering in the West Bank in UN schools. And what I've seen there is children growing up in an environment where they don't get taught politics. When they draw pictures of their homes, they draw pictures of soldiers, and they see their brothers at night getting imprisoned, taken and put into prison. What are these children growing up understanding? What do we have for the future?
Okay. Thank you. Well, on that point, the clock's against us, so I'm going to move on to a question from Chloe Heaver, please. Chloe Heaver.
Why should prisoners who have shown they cannot abide by the laws be given a say into how society is run?
In other words, should prisoners be given the vote as is being proposed? Yvette Cooper, are you in favour of prisoners having the vote?
No, I've always thought that it was proportionate and reasonable for prisoners to forgo their right to vote, because in the same way that if you've committed a serious crime, you lose your liberty, you have restrictions on your right to a family life, and during that period, I think you should also forgo your right to have a say in who the lawmakers of the land are, because you have broken the law in such a significant way. So I think it's proportionate. I think it's therefore the European Court has said that they think the ban on prisoner voting is indiscriminate, is a sort of blanket ban. I actually don't think it's indiscriminate. I think it's very discriminating, because you lose your right to vote in proportion to your sentence, which is decided in the courts and which is in proportion to your crime. That's why I've always supported it, and I think it's the right thing to do.
You've lost me there. You say that you lose your right to vote in proportion to the length of the sentence.
Yes, in other words, while you're in prison. So while you're in prison, you lose your right to vote. So
right. It's not proportional to the length of the sentence. Yeah, I see,
That's what I mean. Yes, it's not indefinite. When you are released from prison, you would also, you get your right to vote back because you've served your time.
So the European Court of Human Rights saying that it's illegal for us to do this, you would flout their injunction.
Well, I think that I disagree with the court's judgment. I think, in fact, by making this a decision, it is actually in the spirit of the convention, the European Convention, which I think is important. We did sign up to it, and we do have international obligations. And I think having a proportionate ban is in compliance with the European Convention. I think what the government is trying to do here is to find a way through where we now have a debate in Parliament. We try and set out detailed legislation, because the courts rightly criticised us for not having had detailed legislation before the Parliament and discussed that in some detail. I hope we will be able to do that and then take that back to the court and convince the court that that is in compliance with the Convention and in the spirit of it as well.
Just to clarify, you are Shadow Home Secretary for Labour. Are you saying you would say no vote for anyone while they're in prison? Is that Labour's position?
We've now got the legislation that's been put out sets out a series of options.
I'm asking you what your view is.
I know, and our long-standing view has always been that prisoners should not have the right to vote while they are in prison, and that continues to be our view. We'll obviously have to look at what the government recommends, what its legal advice is. We've asked the government to show us what its legal advice is, but that continues to be our position. Okay. We will obviously work with the government on the parliamentary process to try and get this legislation right.
All right, the woman with the red pullover on there.
But by the MPs, in the British Parliament, defying the rule set by the European Court to,
The European Court saying that they must give prisoners some sort of voting rights.
Are they not sort of setting a bit of a bad example to society about breaking the rule of law, and especially because considering it's to do with prisoners.
Duncan Smith, you're setting a bad example by not doing what the European Court of Human Rights says you should.
Well, actually not, because I agree that this is the point that was made earlier on this week by Dominic Grieve and also by Chris Grayling today, and Yvette knows this as well, that in reality we have always been a law-abiding nation, and we stand by our obligations that we sign up to internationally. I think we shouldn't be setting precedents that say just ignore these things. I mean, if we don't like it all, then we have to have a big debate about where the Convention of Human Rights stands, but not just to ignore what we don't like. So what Chris Grayling today, the Justice Secretary, announced out that Yvette was referring to just then, is that what they have asked us to do is we should have placed legislation, they say, in front of the House to decide what we will do about their judgment. And so today he said that we will essentially place legislation in front of the House which will give the House of Commons options to either have no votes for prisoners, votes for prisoners up under 6 months interred, and prisoners between 6 and 4 years. So in other words, we're saying to Parliament is sovereign. At the end of the day, Parliament will make that decision. After all, the British people elected Parliament to make decisions about their laws, not the Convention of Human Rights. That is where it should stand. At some point, Parliament will get that option. When they vote on it, that position, the government's position will be that Parliament's sovereign decision stands, and my personal view has been that I have never been in favour of seeing prisoners get the vote. I think if you go out and commit crimes, you lose the right to decide who governs you and who sets the laws.
So you would... You're saying if Parliament votes for the option that says no one in prison should have the vote, you would stick with that and defy the European Court of Human Rights.
Well, it's not defying. The point
is... It would be defying, because they tell you you've got to have some...
No.
They just want you to discuss it.
What they want you to do is to legislate on the basis of what their decision was. Now, Parliament, however, is sovereign. and Parliament, at the end of the day, makes final decisions about the law of this land, and that is the reality. And so we will make a decision about that. Right. And I also believe Parliament is absolutely, it's a point we forget about, Parliament is sovereign. Everybody out here elected us to make decisions. I think we should make the decision in Parliament, and that decision should stand.
Okay.
Do you not think that maybe there's an argument that if you've been in prison, particularly for a longer period of time, that as part of your rehabilitation, you should be encouraged to be involved in society?
Yes?
You know, if you're released within 6 months, if there's a general election or something like that, that you are allowed to partake in the election.
What do you think?
I think a proportion of people who end up in prison or commit a crime because society isn't working for them. And I think if you take away their right to vote in all capacity, in terms of people on remand or people there for less than 6 months, they have no impact or no influence on the change that can happen in society in the future.
Charles Kennedy, you have an option if it comes to the vote of people with 6 months only, people 4 years, or absolutely no, anyone in prison can't have a vote. How would you vote?
Well, we're going to have, I'll make my mind up absolutely finally when the committee that is now going to look at this is, it's a terrible mouthful, but it's a pre-legislative committee, pre-legislative proposal. Yeah. In other words, they have hearings, everybody under the sun can contribute their thoughts, from absolutely no votes for anybody to some partial exemptions from such a ban, etc., etc. And it makes sense. If we've just agreed to do that today in the House of Commons, then let's see what comes back. I think myself...
You mean you're just going to listen to what people say?
I know, what a terrible thing for an MP to do. Listen to the collective wisdom and then come to your final decision. I think, however, ladies and gentlemen, and here I'll make myself unpopular in front of millions of people, you should know where I'm coming from, which is that I do not support a blanket ban on people in prison not being allowed to vote, which is the basis of this European ruling. I think that there can be a degree of sensible divergence from that, which I think at the end of the day, in years to come, will square this circle between the House of Commons and Strasbourg, which I hope it will. And I think there's very positive reasons why those on shorter sentences should not be denied the right to vote as part of the rehabilitation process.
Deborah Meaden.
I am actually pretty clear on this. I do think they should lose the right to vote. I don't think it stops them engaging in the political process. You can still discuss it. You can still talk about it in prison. And actually you can then hope that when you actually enter society again, you can take part. There's a but. That's half of the argument. The other half of the argument says, I think it's a very dangerous route to pick and choose what we do and don't agree with under the Human Rights Convention. Because not only, we actually, whether we feel it or not, live in a pretty protected environment. But what signal does that send out to some of those countries out there who really need protection under that human rights protection? And that really, well, we consider ourselves, we think the world looks to us, not completely, but we do consider ourselves influential in the world, and I think we are. And I think picking and choosing in terms of human rights is wrong, and that worries me. And in those two arguments, when I weigh those up, I think we should stick to it. I know you're going to talk about the legality of it, and you're going to...
asked us to make a decision.
He's not.
OK. The man there with spectacles, you say? No, you, yes, sorry, without spectacles. Yeah.
If the prisoners were going to be given a vote, isn't there a danger that politicians could start appealing to this particular demographic? I don't know how many people there are in prison, but is there not a chance that, you know, policies could be catered towards some sort of favourability to get
when the prisoners vote? Owen Jones, be brief on this, Owen, if you would.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if MPs start rocking up to Pentonville and asking people how they're going to vote. Well, maybe not. I'd say, I think a couple of things, actually. A really important point about the European Court of Human Rights. It's separate from the EU. And the problem we've got, I think, which is a really important point to make, is there's lots of countries signed up to it with pretty poor human rights records, such as Russia, for example. Now, how can we put pressure on those countries to abide by the European Court and actually improve their human rights record record if we start picking and choosing. And the point also to make is it isn't a blanket ban. People are worried, I think, about murderers and rapists basically getting the right to vote. Now, I'm not going to, I'm not somebody who lives in some sort of out-of-touch ivory tower. I've been a victim of crime many times, like many of you. I've been violently mugged. I've been burgled in my own
get
house.
to the point about voting.
The point I would make, and it's a really important point to make, is people on short-term sentences, you're trying to rehabilitate them, integrate them back into society. What better way of doing that than giving them the right to vote and making them citizens again who are connected with society?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to hurry you all along, but we've got time for one more question. Debbie Wild, please. Debbie Wild.
Under the benefit cap, should large unemployed families priced out of London move to cheaper areas, or should councils subsidise them to stay?
Under benefit cap, should large unemployed families be priced out of London, move to cheaper areas, or should councils subsidise them to stay? Deborah Meaden.
Oh my goodness! I was hoping to have a little.
Well, you can pass and let Iain Duncan Smith answer it if you like, and then come back.
Actually, shall I do that and then I'll respond to it? Oh, okay, there we are.
Iain Duncan Smith. Rare moment.
Let's get we should say what the cap is about. The cap is about putting the benefit cap rather than the housing cap. Is about putting a limit to the amount of money that somebody on benefits can receive. The limit we're setting actually is at £35,000 a year gross, £26,000 net, which is essentially average earnings. That is a cap that says they can't earn more than that. There are some exemptions, people on disability living allowance, war widows, people who are essentially on working tax credits, they don't get. So it's those who are not working who are not in those exemptions. Does that mean that they should subsidise them? Well, there's already money to help councils to make sure they get settled in the right houses. I don't think there is any need for people to be transferred outside. There is housing inside London and the South East area that actually accommodates them. The reality is we're in touch with all the councils right now, and we're ensuring that essentially they get the money that they need to get to make sure people can be tided over if they've got kids in school, etc. But the key point here to get absolutely right is this cap is about saying, look, when people work out there and they get to average earnings, it is quite mad that we end up paying benefits to people at way higher because they live in very expensive accommodation in different parts of London and the South East. So the cap is fairness to taxpayers as well as being fairness to benefit payers.
Yvette Cooper. Do you agree with that?
I think that there is an issue about making sure that you're not spending a huge amount of money on the large houses in the highest cost areas where some large families do need, larger housing. I think that it's right too to have restrictions on the level of benefits that are paid out and on the payments made by the taxpayer. But I think the problem with the way that the government is doing this is that actually the full consequences, not just of the measures that Iain's talking about, but a whole series of other changes that they're making, are actually pushing up homelessness. We've seen a 50% increase in the number of families with children living in bed and breakfast accommodation. That means they can't actually sit and have a meal at a table. They're sitting, eating food on their laps. They don't have any privacy. They're cramped into that accommodation. That's really bad for the kids growing up. It also costs us a huge amount more.
Which government policy is it that Iain Duncan Smith has introduced that is causing that?
It's a mix of them. I think it's a mix of some of the housing benefit changes, but also the benefit cap. It's the combination of the way in which they've introduced.
It doesn't start till April, by the way, just in case you want to know about that.
The combination of the mix of changes that the government is introducing, it is crazy if we end up with welfare reforms that, however well-intentioned, end up costing the taxpayer more, and that's what you should change.
All right, you stay on the front. Come on, we must keep moving here. It's a good debate. Yes.
Yeah, I think the introduction of the benefits was a good thing in the first place. However, it's become quite absurd to think that someone who is not working and getting benefits should earn more than someone who is. I think it's quite absurd. So I think the cap is reasonable, it's appropriate.
All right, Owen Jones.
Firstly, the reason that this whole debate has become so toxic is a cynical demonisation campaign of people on benefits by this government. What they are doing, and you can nod your head in as much as you want. You can shake your head as much as you want, Iain. But what they've tried to do is redirect people's justifiable anger at the ever-declining living standards from those at the top who caused this crisis to people's neighbours down the street. The working poor against the unemployed over benefits. Non-disabled people against disabled people over benefits.
£26,000 a year.
Private sector workers against public sector workers over pensions. That housing benefit,
housing benefit
is not going into the... That housing benefit is not going into the
I'll come to you in a
pockets.
moment.
Let me sorry, I'll come on to that.
No, don't. No, just to answer Iain Duncan's
Housing
Smith's
benefit
point.
is not going into the
£6,000
pockets. Housing benefit is not going into the pockets of tenants. It's lining the pockets of wealthy landlords charging extortionate rents because successive governments, New Labour included, bring some council housing. But I have to raise that point the audience has just raised about disabled people, because it isn't just about the cap. And if there are two names,
But they're exempted
if there's
from
anything,
the cap.
if there's anything I want you to remember from this
Disabled
programme,
people are exempted from the
there are
cap.
two names I
Will
want
you
you to
accept that?
remember.
No, disabled people are exempted from
Brian
the cap.
McArdle.
No, listen. The question is
We've got to widen
Don't go off onto some other. Don't go off some other agenda you have. Answer the question about unemployed families. That was
the
what you
point
were
about
after.
unemployed families. At the moment, as I've said, that housing benefit isn't going into them. It's lining the pockets of landlords because
All right.
successive governments didn't
Charles Kennedy.
Well, I don't doubt Owen's sincerity in this matter at all, but I mean, I hope he would accept I'm not somebody who can readily be labelled as part of some terrible political conspiracy to single out groups in society and try and blame them on all our ills. I think clearly the housing benefit system, and indeed I think Yvette has alluded to this as well, has burgeoned to such an extent that even without the austerity package, now that's a different debate that we could all have, but even without the need for an austerity package or the extent of the austerity package, any government here today, of whatever political persuasion, would have to address it, and indeed Labour were doing so.
But you don't agree with Sarah Tether, your former minister, who said that the welfare cap was immoral?
No, well, I think when politicians start using words like immoral, I mean, I'd probably leave that to Anglican bishops, actually, to talk about immorality. What surprises me about her comments, I don't know if she's clarified this or not, she's perfectly entitled to her view. I don't think that what Iain Duncan Smith is doing is immoral. I don't think in opposition what Iain did in terms of his Centre for Social Justice was immoral either.
All right, don't shout out. Let him. Madam, please don't shout out from the back. Please don't shout out. Let him speak.
I'm not complaining at all, madam. This is the home of free speech. I can hardly disagree with that, can I?
All right. But then, we probably can't hear what you're saying anyway. All right. Deborah Meaden.
I want to pick up on a point, Owen, and you talk about the demonisation of people on welfare benefits. I personally think that's a pretty outdated view, because there are a lot of people who are... We are in... Welfare benefits happen to be a very sad, awful truth of the moment. Truth of the matter is this country has got so much... the same as any company with any budget has got so much money to spend. I think it is very wise to make sure that we allocate... I think it's very wise to make sure that we have a cap on benefits. But I also think it's very wise to make sure that those people who are the neediest get that money. The right people get that money. And that's what we need.
But the problem is that at the moment, what you're getting is you've got working families who are losing thousands of pounds in their tax credits. That's working families at the same time as millionaires are getting a £40,000 tax cut. That is what's unfair.
Most new claimants of housing benefit are in work. They don't have enough money to pay extortionate rents. If we built housing in this country, we'd bring down the welfare bill, stimulate the economy and create jobs. But there is a point as well that has to be made about the treatment of disabled people in this country. And there are two names I just want to give Iain, and if there's anything he remembers, it's this. Brian McArdle, 57 years old, paralysed down one side, blind in one eye, he couldn't speak. He died one day after being found fit for work by ATOS. Another example, Karen Sherlock.
Hang on a second, we've heard a lot from you. Let me tell you something. I didn't hear you screaming about 2.5 million people who are parked, nobody saw them for over 10 years, not working, with no hope, no aspiration. We are changing their lives. I'm proud of doing that. Getting them off benefit is what we're going to do.
1,100 people.
All right, that's it. I'm afraid our time's up. Apologies. No, I know I can see you want to speak, but we've got to stop because our hour is up, and that is the story of Question Time. We always have to stop when things are just getting going. I'd just like to say thank you to Parliament for being our host here. This is part of Parliament Week that we're here in Westminster Hall. Next week, Swansea. And on the day Lord Leveson publishes his report into the press, our panel is going to include the singer Charlotte Church and the former executive editor of the News of the World, Neil Wallace. And the following week we're going to be in Liverpool. So if you want to come either to Swansea or Liverpool, put questions to the panel, indeed argue with them, visit our website, the address is on the screen, or call 0330 123 99 88, the number there. Just leaves me to thank our panel and thank all of you who came to take part. From Westminster Hall in London, good night.
And the debate on women bishops continues next on BBC One as author Anne Atkins asks where this now leaves the Church of England this week.